Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another broadcast of the Lawrence Report. On tonight's broadcast, we will be discussing episode 3 of Lawmen, Bass Reeves. Now, in this episode right here, we see Bass Reeves arrives to Fort Smith, Arkansas to finally meet Judge Parker. In the previous episode, we found out that, Judge Parker is recruiting Bass to become a U.S. Marshal. So Bass arrives to the courthouse and he meets Judge Parker. And Judge Parker basically tells him, I recruited you because not only are you a person of color, but I think by you being a person of color, you'll be able to help us be able to better communicate with the Native Americans. Basically, back in the day, of course, even now, a lot of times people of color are willing to trust another person of color, hence the Black and Native American barriers right there, right? But not only that, Judge Parker says, hey, I need a shooter, and I think you're one of the best that I've ever seen. So during this time right here, Judge Parker, he kind of compares Bass to Cheryl Lynn, and Bass is like, no, please don't compare me to Cheryl Lynn. I want to be my own man. I will never be Cheryl Lynn, because in the previous episode we saw how Cheryl Lynn is kind of very divisive, kind of hate driven. But besides that, Judge Parker asked Bass to put his hand over the Bible and basically say the oath, and they do the oath, and Bass, he sees this young African American male teenager by the name of, I believe his name was My Son. Yeah, My Son. And, the kid is in there for basically, well, he's, in handcuffs, sitting on the bench, basically for stealing food and killing someone while doing so. And Bass, he kind of feels bad for the kid, but at the same time, Bass has to carry on his duty. So for Bass, his first assignment is finding this Native American by the name of Billy Crow. And I love the way Bass says this, says his name in episode 3, Billy Crow. David Oyelowo is actually killing this right here, actually. So Bass encounters a guy by the name of Garrett Montgomery. And they're searching for, like I said, Billy Crow. And Garrett says, hey, do you have a posse, man? And Bass is like, well, it depends on who's asking. And Garrett's kind of like, well, I know this area, I could help you out. If you want me to, I could be your posse, man. So basically, Garrett decides to be his Robin to Bass's Batman. So they team up together and they come across this parlor. Again, they're still searching for Billy Crow. It's like a card gambling parlor. And they walk inside, and they're trying to get information. And Bass, he noticed that the bartender is saying, hey, this is the guy you're working with right here? And Bass says, yeah. Well, it turns out that, unfortunately, Garrett has a lot of unpaid debts in the town. So, of course, being in the West and, or even in the South, you're saying you have a bunch of unpaid debts. And, of course, if you don't pay people back, eventually they're going to come out to get you, right? So Bass, he listens closely. He looks to his left and he sees this card game going on. And he plays these guys for cards. And, Bass ends up winning the card game, but he doesn't want the pot. He doesn't want the money. He just wants the information. And so, as they're leaving this parlor, they see potentially Billy Crow. And it turns out that is Billy Crow. And they question this man because this man is of Indian descent. And, Bass pulls out this reward that says that this man is wanted. And, of course, Billy panics and starts running. And, yeah, that ends up being Billy Crow. So they catch Billy Crow. But at the same time, we see that the camera veers off to these two men. These two men are watching Garrett. And with that situation right there, it turns out to be very, very bad. So nightfall comes and Bass, Billy Crow, and Garrett Montgomery, they're basically laying down in the woods waiting to make their next move. And Bass and Garrett kind of get into a slight argument when it comes to the money and basically trying to decide if they should take this guy alive or whatever. And Bass is like, hey, I took an oath. But Garrett is like, I didn't take an oath. I'm going to take him in any way that I can. And while they get into this argument, Bass, he starts to pick up his gun, but he noticed something's going on in the woods. And it turns out it's these men from this previous gang that are basically looking for Garrett and Bass. They end up killing, unfortunately, um, Garrett. They end up shooting him. So Bass is basically in this crossfire because at the same time, these men, they want Bass and Billy Crow. They both want them dead. Bass takes out all the men, and then Bass basically returns back to the courthouse to bring in Billy Crow. Previously I told you that there was a young African American boy who was basically waiting for his sentence. And, as Billy Crow gets turned into jail or whatever, Bass is in this courtroom seeing how this young man who basically, like I said, he stole food. And the judge says, hey, I'm sorry that you was hungry, but killing another man for food is not good. I have to, unfortunately, hang you. And, of course, Bass' heart kind of sinks because he's like, I feel like this young man could have been potentially saved. But it didn't go well. So Bass does capture his first person, his first big fish in the sea, which was Billy Crow. But at the same time, Bass is dealing with some family issues. His wife welcomes another child. I think Bass ended up having 10 or 11 kids before it was all said and done. And yeah, that right there is basically episode 3 of Lawmen, Bass Reeves. If you're watching this show, please feel free to comment, subscribe, like, and share. I'm already pumped for episode 4, so let's see what we can do. As always, thank you for tuning in to the Lawrence Report.